In the name of God, who is love, amen. So let me begin by talking about the temple in Jesus' day and then make some connections to our own time. Today we have churches, mosques, and temples all over, but in Jesus' time there was only one temple located in Jerusalem, which was a cosmopolitan and diverse setting that attracted pilgrims and worshipers from all over. The temple itself was not very large. It could fit inside the inside of an infield of a baseball field. But the surrounding area was said to be as large as 10 football fields. This was a massive structure where there were plazas and porticos and dividing walls, which blocked the way to the center, where only priests had access with animals that were purchased for sacrifice. Those who worked at the temple were very eager to cash in on the religious impulse of the masses, who seized upon this Passover moment, which was a hopeful narrative of liberation while they all lived in Roman occupation. Jewish historian Josephus reports a census in which tens of thousands of lambs were slaughtered during the time of Passover. The temple was thought by everyone to be the most sacred place on earth, even amidst this sacrificial system. It had an enormously shaping effect on human consciousness. Yet there were tremendous barriers which blocked the way to God, barriers which had the most impact on the poor and the foreigners. For Jesus, who is bringing a new narrative onto the scene, sacred space is meant for access and connection to the divine and to one another. So when the space is hijacked and used as a marketplace, when it excludes the poor and the marginalized, Jesus responds very seriously, turning over tables and driving people out with whips. Now, I want to talk about anger in a moment. But first, how many of you have heard of Dan Siegel? This is Ed's brain science teacher. Sorry if that caused you a little whiplash. Dr. Siegel was here recently leading us in a soul and synapse retreat. And towards the end of the second day, we had an All Saints contemplative Eucharist scheduled, which was an option for anyone who wanted to attend. Now, Dan Siegel is a scientist and a psychiatrist and not an overtly religious person, but he was intrigued and said he wanted to attend the service. So he finished his last session in the forum downstairs, and he looked at me and he said, "Well, isn't this the church down here?" And I said, "No, the church is in a different space." And so we walked up together into this sanctuary that we're all in today, and Dan looked at me confused and disoriented as I gave him a liturgy. He was stunned and he said, "Is this a Catholic church?" It's as if he was asking himself, is my teaching and work on universal compassion, integration of self and communities, healing and rewiring of neural pathways, meditation and mindfulness practice, is that being talked about in a church like this? Friends, there may not be animal carcasses or plazas or porticos, but the barriers today to a life-giving experience of God in religious settings have been just as profound today as in Jesus' time. We could pause and let this thought sink in a bit. I know it still is for me. Richard Rohr said recently that no culture can survive if it hates its religion, and that's where we are right now. How do we continue to move religious buildings from being symbols of ruins to places that help draw out the best of human impulses for meaning-making, for life-giving human communities, and for making the world a better place? Allowing this gospel to shed some light on this question, I begin with the topic of anger. I have most often heard this gospel translated into a basic formula, which says essentially Thank God that Jesus expresses anger like this. I feel this way often and wish I could let people have it in the same way, and now I feel justified. We've all been there, right? Jesus validates righteous indignation. Let's not lose this interpretation. But I invite us to think about this account in a different way. Think about how rarely Jesus expresses this kind of table-turning anger. There is a difference between anger that is by choice, intentionally expressed at an appropriate time, and anger that is patterned, repetitive, and defining of one's identity. There is a difference between anger that is driven by shadow towards people and anger that is directed at injustice, which is born of tears. Yesterday, as some of you may know, was the 50th anniversary of Bloody Sunday in Selma, Alabama, where on March 7, 1965, 600 peaceful protesters were viciously attacked with billy clubs and with tear gas by law enforcement officers. En route to Montgomery, which eventually led to the passing of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. To the present day, we could say in one breath that we have made so much progress since then, and in another breath, with the release of the Ferguson report by the Department of Justice, it can feel like we are in Selma all over again. Now let me say a few words about race this morning through the eyes of a young, white, privileged male living in the 21st century. I grew up spending a significant amount of time at my grandmother's house, who was one of the first female leaders in the urban church in which I was raised. She chose to live in this lower socioeconomic neighborhood in Muskegon, Michigan, which was dominantly African American, while the church continued to serve in this setting. For years, I played basketball every day at the park after school, where I was the only white person on the courts. My nickname at the park was Billy Ho, after the white character in the 1992 film, White Men Can't Jump. But I could actually jump. For years, I experienced a combination of fear and fascination towards the African American other to me. I was privileged to have friendship with my black brothers and sisters, and also violence done unto me on more than one occasion. Recently, I was in a phone conversation here at All Saints with a colleague about MLK Sunday, and we were casually discussing adult ed options, and I suggested an idea which would be a white presenter, and my colleague said matter-of-factly, well, I don't know if anyone wants to hear from a white person on MLK Day. And I get it. I've heard this expressed in various ways over the years, and yet this year, I had a fire come up in my belly, and I didn't know what it was about. And after a few moments of meditation to tune into myself, I had a memory come up of me being beat up on the school bus when I was about 8 years old by who I perceived at the time as an angry black boy. Now, this is not a new memory for me. I've processed this and other experiences around race and multiculturalism, and I'm on my journey towards deeper self-understanding. Yet, what effect would these early experiences in my life have if I did not have countless opportunities in anti-racism trainings, multicultural work, relationships with many black colleagues and friends to see me for who I am and to help me understand what it's like to see through the eyes of a person of color in America, and to help me with my own bias and prejudice, which may be operating out of my awareness. As I can re-own the shadows of wound and fear in myself, now I have a choice of where to direct my anger rather than being mastered by it. Getting healthier means gaining more choices. Now the same reservoirs of fear in me can be converted into productive anger, which can turn over tables against injustice and not against people. This morning, I am suggesting that some of the most fruitful work in continuing the dream of a beautiful world that is in love with diversity is creating safe spaces where people of historic privilege and power can be helped in processing shadow racism and fear. And for people of color or anyone who is part of a historically oppressed group to find the strength to welcome this kind of sharing without being consumed in hatred on the other side. And I would say for anyone serious about this work, let's claim this work in this building for MLK Day or any other day of the year. When Greg Boyle, leader of Homeboy Industries, was here recently, he and Ed were in a conversation in the Rector's Forum about Ferguson. And in response to one question, Greg Boyle said something to the effect of that God is too busy loving to be disappointed in us. God is too busy loving to be disappointed in us. Now, I'm all for this thought for myself and other decent people out there, but when I hear this statement, for some reason my mind goes instantly to those policemen who are branded with the title, Cops Who Kill Unarmed Black Men. Is God too busy loving them to be disappointed? This is an offensive thought on some level, and yet I think it is true that even their identity is more complex and tragic than this rage-inducing description. It is a gut-wrenching, gritty, arduous road to learn that our enemy is not of flesh and blood, but our enemy is the rage in us that believes we have something to fear. Perhaps this is another way of understanding the foolishness in the way of the cross that we read about earlier in 1 Corinthians. Maybe this is the deep work of which Lent takes us. At the Soul and Synapse retreat, Dan Siegel shared with us an idea for God that he is attracted to, which is an acronym, God, G-O-D, as Generation of Diversity, which means for him to perpetually explore and enjoy the mystery of the other. He raised the point that young people today are wanting jobs that help the world become a better place. We are quite ready to get into spaces and talk to each other, not just about what we are against, but about a beautiful vision of diversity that we are for. I close with one last story. Several months ago, I was serving communion, and there was a woman who was crying as she was receiving, which is not unusual, of course. But when I came back through, I noticed that there was a very large teardrop that was left on the altar rail. It was really quite poetic. I wanted to take my camera out and take a picture, but I didn't think that'd be appropriate at the communion rail. Teardrops represent something that is destroyed, broken, or lost that we can't get back. And in the same pool, there lies our joy and hope as well. The Eucharist holds all of this. It is a symbol of destruction of Jesus' life, which leads us on a path of unknowing, of less control and more vulnerability. It is the equalizing ground for all of humanity. There's a stunning insight at the end of this gospel reading, I think. Jesus said, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up." He was talking about his flesh, his own body, which is now the temple, the living sacred space of which all of us embody. After Jesus was raised from the dead, his disciples remembered and believed. Only after, only in retrospect. And the insight is this, that real resurrection and joy always lives on the other side of a thick cloud of unknowing. And that cloud may be years, or perhaps even a lifetime. So as the journey continues, may we find a home in this uneasy and wonderful space called life, learning to love and allowing our faith to grow stronger. May our kneeling with unclenched, open hands give rise to our authority. And may our tears be our most reliable signposts on the journey. Amen.